So, good evening, everybody. We are commencing our next session of our traditional Nostratic seminar. And today we have a wonderful guest from the University of Utrecht, Dr. Peter Schrijver, who is going to talk about the historical phonology of East Caucasian, which is a complicated and very interesting topic. And it's been a really long time, I guess, since we had a topic on diachronic Caucasian linguistics at the seminar. So this is a really special occasion. And I'm very happy and excited to turn the microphone over to Dr. Schrijver for his talk and presentation, please.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to present to the seminar. It's both an honor and a great pleasure to be able to make a presentation to you today. Can you hear me well when I speak? Is that
yes,
okay?
I think so.
Okay, great. I'm a Celticist, a historical Celticist by nature, I would almost say, by profession, and I've been delving into the history of the Caucasian languages since about a decade now, mainly in order for me as an Indo-Europeanist to see whether when one reconstructs Caucasian languages, especially East Caucasian languages, whether the methodology works the same or is very different. And this has taken me on a bumpy ride, and I'd like to show you some of the things that I find interesting about it, hoping that you will find them interesting too. Well, let's start with a very brief introduction to the family, in as far as you need it, obviously. East Caucasian is the language family I'll be talking about, which has two main branches, the Nach branch containing Chechen, Ingush, and Batspi, and the much larger or much more diverse Dagestanian branch, consisting of the northern Avar-Andic-Cesic branch, and then the Lak and Dargwa branches, and then the numerous Lesgic branch in the south. I'll be mainly speaking about Avar-Andic-Cesic, and within that group mainly about the Cesic languages, because that is the group that I've been focusing on, and especially on the historical phonology of those languages. But I also will discuss, when relevant, some issues from Avar and from some of the Andic languages, but will be mostly about Cesic and its wider ramifications for the reconstruction of East Caucasian. The Cesic branch within Avar-Andic-Cesic is the southwesternmost of that particular sub-branch, bordering in the west on Chechnya and in the south on Georgia, with the languages Tsez, Hinuk, and Khwarshi and Inglokwar. I regard them as four languages rather than the traditional three, where Khwarshi and Inglokwar are taken together, but they are very different, so it's best to separate them. And these four languages constitute the western branch of Cesic, and then as the Beshta and Hunzib language that consist of that form the eastern branch of that family. I will have little to say about Lesgic, not because it's not interesting, but simply because I know very little about it. I'm not a specialist in that, and it has a complex historical phonology, and people have been working on it, not least, of course, Sergei Starostin, who's a great example for my work as well. It is controversial, depending on who you ask, whether East Caucasian is cognate with West Caucasian, consisting of Circassian, Abkhaz, and Ubykh, which then together form North Caucasian family. I'm convinced that it's correct, but there are people who are not. So let us first delve into the bigger issues. And I've put it rather bluntly as why bother reconstructing Proto-East Caucasian, because there are so many languages and language families in the world that need reconstruction. What is so special about Proto-East Caucasian, about the East Caucasian language family? Well, any reason to reconstruct any language is a good reason as far as I'm concerned, but there are special reasons why I feel East Caucasian is especially interesting and relevant. This partly has to do with my background in linguistics, which is as an Indo-Europeanist, and the strides, the progress that has been made over the last decade, one should say, it's almost exactly a decade, in connecting the earliest speakers of Indo-European with populations of real people. And traditionally, there have been the two main theories among Indo-Europeanists and archaeologists who have been working on the issue, which state that, on the one hand, that's a traditional view, one could say, that Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European stems from a population connected to the Yamnaya cultures on the Eastern European and Southwestern Asian steppe area. And the other theory is that this is not correct, or maybe this is a later offshoot of Proto-Indo-European, but the original homeland of Indo-European is to be sought amongst the early agriculturalists in Anatolia, who from the 7th millennium onwards spread into Europe and took along Indo-European. And then came along archaeogenetics, which really took off about 15 years ago with the unraveling of Denisova, of course. But then in 2015, 2 articles appeared, very important articles. In fact, 3 articles, but 2 articles were really important. That gave a real boost to the idea that Indo-European was no doubt found its origin among the speakers of the Yamnaya cultures on the Eurasian steppe between 3400 and 2600 BC. And the boost consisted of the fact that archaeogenetics had been able, on the basis of the analysis of ancient DNA, and that's of course the big stride that was taken on the basis of the analysis of ancient genes, to trace a population movement indeed from the European steppes in the period under consideration into Europe, into what is called the corded ware culture of northern Central Europe. And archaeologists have always considered the Yamnaya cultures and corded ware cultures as very different from one another, but they were now bridged by archaeogenetic evidence stating that there was a huge influx of genes from the steppes into Central Europe. And that mapped very well onto the idea that this is what brought Indo-European into Europe. So this is one thing. But then, if Proto-Indo-European indeed equals the carriers of the Yamnaya culture, then the question was, what is Proto-Anatolian? So the Indo-European branch is spoken in Anatolia, present-day Turkey, because they lack a Yamnaya genetic signature. So did Proto-Indo-European originate on the steppes, and was there then a linguistic movement across the Caucasus towards Anatolia that brought Indo-European into Anatolia, or was it the other way around? Are we looking at an ancient Anatolian population that crossed and that spoke Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, then crossed the Caucasus, at least the languages did in some form, and then ended up as the Indo-European on the steppes? Of course, the Caucasus is in the middle of all this. And then earlier this year, there appeared 2 articles, again by archaeogeneticists, that found a population between the lower Volga River and the Caucasus, who they say is the population where the, let's call them Yamnaya genes, and the genes of the speakers of the earliest Anatolian languages originated. So we're coming ever closer to the Caucasus, and then if this is the true story about Indo-European, and I have no doubt that the story will change as time progresses, this is fairly recent research, obviously, that needs to be digested and refined, as it has always been the case over the last couple of years. It seems, whatever the story, there are two branches of Indo-European, one north of the Caucasus and one south of it. And there must have been a migration of people across the Caucasus, and it now looks it was a north-south migration that brought Indo-European into Anatolia. So what does that mean for the relationship between Indo-European and its neighboring languages? And then one would dearly like to know the prehistory of the East Caucasian and West Caucasian languages, obviously, in order to make a qualified judgment about that. If this is all correct, then it means that the original hypothesis of Indo-European originating as the language of the earliest agriculturalists from Anatolia that moved into Europe is incorrect, that this is a different language family. We are quite sure that people migrated from Anatolia, bringing along agriculture into Europe, but also towards the east, into Asia. What did they speak? Well, apparently a language family that's no longer well represented, at least not in Europe, with a potential exception of Basque. But that's still very unclear. And just to inform you of the possibility, I'm not going into this very much. I've been publishing about this, that there is a prime candidate which you can find in the Minoan language of second millennium Crete, and its potential relationship to the Hattic language of central northern Anatolia. And if you analyze the Hattic verbal system, it's so like Sumerian, at least that's what I think, that this is more than just typology. This is not type identifying, but it is individual identifying similarities. So maybe we're looking at a lost language family of which these three form part, and that was responsible for bringing agriculture into Europe and many other parts from the 7th millennium BC onwards. And then always the question is, if there is a language family that has disappeared, did it leave a trace in the Caucasus, as so many other language families did? So again, questions are asked about how about Caucasian languages? And the third major question has to do, well, with exactly this question. If you look at East Caucasian, or maybe take it wider as North Caucasian, question is the same. Is this a language family that originated in the Caucasus, or is it a residue of a much larger language family that was represented outside of the Caucasus? As we know, happened so many other times, most recently with the Turkic language family originating from Central Asia, which left Kumuk and Karachay-Balkar. And at an earlier stage, there was the Iranian spread across much of Eastern Europe and Western Eurasia that left Ossetic. And of course, before that, there was apparently Armenian, left by a very early offshoot of Indo-European. So might one conceive of the idea that East Caucasian itself represents a residue of an earlier spread still? Now, in a sense, I think everybody would say, yes, that's rather obvious. East Caucasian is part of the human language family, you could say. So obviously it has relations outside of the Caucasus, and if you zoom in closer and are a believer in the Sino-Caucasian hypothesis, it's obvious that at some point the earlier speakers of East Caucasian must have entered the Caucasus. But what I mean is more specific. It is, look at East Caucasian itself. So are the East Caucasian languages as we know them, that are only represented in the Caucasus, is that a residue of a much wider spread of East Caucasian itself, outside of the Caucasus? Now, these are big questions, and even if you're interested in them, they take a very long time to answer, I think, because they require a very good understanding of the historical phonology of all the languages involved, which, in the case of East Caucasian, at least compared to Indo-European, is still in its infancy. And I don't think there's as yet a shortcut. I don't think phylogenetic methods or other computational methods applied to lots of language data can substitute the detailed reconstruction, because they're normally not designed to reconstruct protoforms. Who knows what the future might bring. Up to now, it's not been successful. So in order to make headway with the bigger questions, let's start small, and that's what I've been trying to do with the phonological reconstruction of Cäsic. And I'll take you to the vowel system and vowel alternations in Cäsic, to paradigmatic syllable loss in Cäsic and afarandic Cäsic, and also into word final resonant alternations and issues like nasalization and pharyngalization that seem to move across the entire word in these languages. So let's start with the vowel system. Proto-Cäsic vowel system, at least as I reconstruct it, but it's not far off from how others would reconstruct it, consists of 8 vowels: I, E, A, U, O, and O. And this is the system that is preserved only in the Hun-Zip language. The other Cäsic languages have reduced it to a rather boring system, I, A, O, U. Apart from Ingokwar, which preserves the at least traditionally it did, because it seems in modern younger speakers, has merged with U. That doesn't mean that modern Cäsic languages have a simple vowel system, I, A, O, U. They have a more extensive vowel system. Most modern languages have long vowel phonemes. Some have nasalized or pharyngalized vowels. And some have an extra set of front vowels. But these are all, it's generally agreed, secondary, so the result of contraction or loss of segments. And there's a complex issue, which I can't go into and I haven't unraveled, of pharyngalization, which seems to have 3 sources: pharyngals as segments, pharyngalized uvulars, and loss of R, which might sometimes result in pharyngalization. This is a very small print, which you may not be able to see, but what I've been doing at a very simple level is trying to find more conditioned sound changes than have traditionally been assumed to exist. And these conditioned sound changes are indeed there, and they mainly in fact affect the fate of the central vowels I and which in the West Cäsic languages have a tendency to be influenced by a following nasal, and within all Cäsic languages have a tendency to be influenced by the presence of a sibilant. So with that I mean sounds like sh, ch, and j. They turn them into front vowels. Whereas the latter was known beforehand, the former, I think, was rather new, the influence of nasals, which makes the situation of the reconstruction much simpler, I could say. So it is now possible, at least I believe, to make a rather full reconstruction of the details of the development of the vowel system in all the Cäsic languages based on this chart. The only simplification, as far as I can see, is that it doesn't take into account the complex issue of pharyngalization, which sometimes changes vowels, and there's also vowel labialization. Now, let's have a look at some of the shallow sound laws that affect only one language in Cäsic. A well-known one is the following. In Hinuk, so one of the 4 languages of the Western branch, a sound E can turn into an O in front of an original labialized consonant. This is a sound law which you could already find in Imnaishvili's book of 1963. It affects the Ingokwar language as well, where it turns an E into an U. And these are some of the examples. So Hinuk noch The verb for to arrive has an O, where if labialization hadn't occurred, you would expect an E to occur. And why does A turn into an O? Because there was a labialization following it, which has disappeared from some of the languages, but not from all of them. And this labialization has turned an E into O. Curious thing, perhaps, is that it doesn't affect every E in Hinnook, as you would expect if it was really a shallow sound law, but it only affects an E if it derives from an earlier I, and not if it derives from an earlier I or E. So the two examples at the bottom of the page, the word for an uncastrated young ram and the verb to burn, they don't show this rounding. They preserve E. And that has a curious consequence, perhaps, at least curious to me as an Indo-Europeanist. Normally, when you assume that two related languages go through the same phonological development, what you normally assume is that they went through this development at a common node on the family tree when they were still a unit. And if you apply that method to East Caucasian, very often you go wrong. Because it seems it's very often the case that either what looks like it is the same development still took place after the split up of the two branches in which it is observed, or differently, that it might be an early development shared by the two languages, but it was separated. Before that, there was a stage in which they had already split up. So this type of yo-yoing, you could say, where you can't necessarily assume that when a phonological development is identical in two languages, that it belongs to a common node on the family tree. And this is something you can get away with easily in Indo-European. This doesn't work in East Caucasian, is my experience. I'll give you some more examples of that. Another shallow sound law is a well-known one, where in East Caucasian, Beshta and Hunsip, the central vowels and get turned into the front vowels and I before and after velar consonants. I give you 4 examples. There are many more, where the Eastern Caucasian languages have an where the Western languages have the reflex of an which is generally assumed to be the original vocalization. What I think is less well known is that one of the East Caucasian languages, Beshta, also has an A turning into an A before and after velars. So here are some examples. Proto-Caucasian A and O, they merge into A in Beshta, and this is the A that gets turned into A before and after velars. So 4 examples: Baki, Gameth, Anga, and Gara, which show this development. Now, this fronting of A can arise by multiple causes. It can arise because of the presence of a sibilant in the neighborhood, by pharyngalization, or by, at least in one dialect, by the presence in the previous syllable of an earlier I or E. So, but these examples cannot be thus explained. So it seems like, again, it is the velar that is responsible for it. Hunsip, very closely related, is not affected by this. Now, the Beshta development occurred quite clearly after the Beshta merger of O and A into A. A development that was not shared by Hunsip. So one would think that fronting of A in Beshta, caused by this velar, must have occurred later than fronting of I and because this was shared by Beshta and Hunsip. And another reason to think so, that development from A to E in Beshta is a fairly late development, is because labialization of the velar does not interfere in the case of e and fronting, but it does interfere in the case of a fronting. So the first idea would be if you find 3 frontings of 3 vowels caused by velars, it belongs to the same development. Not so. Perhaps only 2 of them were shared by Hunzib and Beshta, fronting of e and but fronting of a is different and presumably later. Or are they? There are many exceptions to this rule of fronting from a to and one I just mentioned. If the velar was labialized, apparently there was no fronting of a. Again, 4 examples. The word for heart is a famous example, rako. So not reko. Why not? Well, because the k was labialized, so apparently more back than a velar that was not labialized, and therefore did not cause fronting of k. So, when this development happened in Beshta, labialization of these consonants must still have been present. But that doesn't sit well with the idea that this is a very late development in Beshta, because we know, at least we normally assumed, the loss of labialization of any consonant was a shared development by Beshta and Hunzib, and the loss of labialization also caused rounding of e and e, again in both languages. So you would normally think the loss of labialization and the accompanying vowel rounding of e and e belongs to the common node of Beshta and Hunzib. See the examples 1, 2, and 3 at the bottom of the page, where you see this labialization occurring. And if that's the case, how can fronting of a be a late development in Beshta? So we end up into all sorts of trouble, which is completely unknown to me from earlier Indo-European languages. Enormous problems in drawing up a relative chronology of sound changes. And I just mentioned one possibility. There are many more, and none of them are neat. So you could say the order is, first of all, in earlier Beshta, a and o merged into a. Early development not shared by Hunzib. Then we get fronting of e and which was shared by Beshta and Hunzib, and of a, which was not shared by Hunzib. And then thirdly, the loss of labialization and concomitant rounding of e and e. Not very neat, because you're splitting and merging at every go, rather than having a clean split. And whatever you do, so there's another possibility at the bottom of the page, you start with loss of labialization and rounding, then Beshta merger of a and o, and then an independent fronting in the 3 languages of e and a. Doesn't really work either. And this, I think, is a central problem to drawing up a relative chronology of sound changes, which is always very important if you work on this subject. Completely new problems, at least I find them stupefying, but we have to deal with them somehow. After these very shallow sound changes and the challenges they put, let's have a look at a deep sound change, which in this case also starts in Cesic. It is probable, not just me thinks that, but it's a relatively general idea. It's probable that all consonants except the labial consonants occurred in labialized form as well. And that most of these are unstable in daughter languages. So labialization is very often lost in daughter languages. And it very much depends on the consonant. So uvulars have a tendency to hold on to labialization longer than other consonants, for example. And an important source of labialization, and that's me coming in, is the progressive shift of rounding from a pretonic labial vowel, that is o, or o, which becomes I, to the following consonant. So if there is a vowel in the pretonic syllable which was rounded, it gets turned into an unrounded I, and the labialization of the vowel shifts to the following consonant. This is my interpretation of a vowel alternation that's been known for a long time. But let's focus on the Cäsic data, first of all, because they're important, because they give you an idea as to the original distribution of these vowel changes, which you get here. So in the diagram at the bottom of the page, I give you 4 examples. The words for moon, sun, tear, and lead, where you can actually see in all languages, or in most languages, that there is a distribution between the rounded vowel being preserved in the first syllable in the absolute case of the paradigm, which is the topmost, whereas in the oblique stem, which forms the basis of all other cases apart from the absolute, you find the unrounded vowel, and I assume the labialization of the following consonant. So this gives you paradigms like it says itself, butsi, oblique stem betze, or nunzi botso, oblique stem bitze. These paradigms were relatively well intact during the period when Cäsic was first recorded in any detail. So let's say around the middle of the last century. So when Ignashvili, for example, was working on it, or Bakaryov, they were still there. But if you look in modern dictionaries, you can see that they're all being regularized. So one of the 2 vowels are generalized. So we have been just in time to capture this phenomenon, it seems. And why is this important? Because it gives you an indication of what the conditioning factor might have been. And going by the stress system of especially Cäs, the rounded vowel that's preserved in the absolutive was stressed as a rule, and the unrounded vowel in the first syllable of the oblique stem was unstressed. And this, I submit, is the original distribution of this phenomenon. Right. So I assume labialization was there always, but it was disappearing later on, and you can still reconstruct it in some forms, because you remember we just talked about Hinuk sometimes rounding the vowel air into an O if a labialization followed. And we do indeed find those instances, for example, in the word for boar and ice in Hinuk, where instead of the expected E becoming E, we find E becoming O. So labialization must have been there originally, although it's no longer present in any of the recorded Cäsic languages in either of these words. Now, moving from Cäsic to Avar and Andic, we there also find this vowel alternation, but it's being completely regularized. So you don't find anymore one and the same paradigm in which the rounded and unrounded vowel alternate, depending on case. You don't find it anymore. So either the rounded or the unrounded vowel has been generalized, as the examples here show. So it's only by looking at Cäsic, among the Avar-Andic Cäsic languages, only by looking at Cäsic that you can get an idea of the original distribution of these rounded and unrounded forms, which is valuable. Now, the surprise came when, at least to me, when this vowel change, which also occurred probably, although it's not been worked out in as much detail in Lak and in Dargwa, and in the Lesgic languages. The surprise to me came when it seemed that also Nach took part in this change. Because if you compare lexical items that show the vowel alternation in Avar-Andic Cäsic, their counterparts in Nach also show vowel alternation. in this case of a rounded vowel in the absolute, and usually the vowel A in the oblique stem instead of E. What I find particularly important in this case is that if you shallowly look at the unrounded vowels in Cäsic, they can be reconstructed to Proto-Cäsic as E or I or U, sometimes even a. But if you work out the historical phonology of Cäsic in more detail, you find that all these vowels, I, U, occur in contexts where they all go back to earlier E. So indeed we have rounded vowels being unrounded to just one vowel, which is E. That brings us closer to an understanding what's going on. Now, let's get into more complicated stuff, at least as far as I'm concerned. Strange things happen in these languages with word final resonance. And the conditions are not entirely clear, I must say. So there are instances where R at the end of the word turns into pharyngalization. I think this is happened only after an unstressed syllable, but it's not entirely clear. That is a wonderful example where irregularity is preserved. These languages are usually very regular, so a lot of analogy and leveling has taken place. But in this case, an irregularity has been preserved in the original word chor, which means sheep or a ram, which in Western Cäsic only occurs in a compound. In Cäsic, bet, which means sheep or ewe. And the second element of that, the ru bit, is related to the chor bit, which as a simplex occurs in Beshta and Hunzib. So what you can see here, as soon as the simplex chor becomes the second member of a compound, and therefore now has an R at the end of the second syllable, the R disappears. Pharyngalization ensues, which you can see in Ingokwar, and you can see in Cēs. This is one of very few valuable archaisms that sort of betray the original conditions, it seems. And then you can apply that rule to other words where R turns into pharyngalization, but you can't really see what the conditioning factor is. But things are more complex, because sometimes an R at the end of the word can also turn into an N, and an L can turn into an N. This also affects so-called CV-CVC roots. So if you have two syllables, a root or stem ending in a consonant and consisting of two syllables, that seems to be the context where this phenomenon occurs. I give you two examples. The word for breast in Cäsic, hamori in Cēs, Chema in Hinuk, Homore meaning cough, probably a derivative, but in Ingokwar, human, meaning breast, with an N. And Beshta from Chomarra, the R is still there, at least it used to be, and in Hunzib, Chibr. Going back to an earlier Proto-Cäsic, Chomor oblique Chemor. And it seems to me that the N must have arisen in the old absolutive at the end of the word, preserved in Ingokwar as such, whereas the oblique R was then preserved in Cēs. Hinuk probably reflects N turning into nasalization and this then disappearing as is regular in this language. And this has a good etymology in East Caucasian in general, where Komor underwent metastasis from an earlier Mokhor, of which you have these examples. A second example is a word we saw earlier, the word for navel, Tsotori, where suddenly in Hwarshi and Ingokwar there's an N popping up instead of the R. So we have basically two rules, R turning into pharyngalization, R, or was it a pharyngalization, turning into an N or nasalization. And why this happens and when it happens is not entirely clear to me. there is in languages such a phenomenon as glotophilia, that nasalization can turn into pharyngalization or glottalization and the other way around. And especially if you look, say, in a modern dictionary of Ingokwar, the Gidalaev dictionary, you can see that where earlier dictionaries or earlier grammars record pharyngalization, the modern dictionary often records nasalization instead. So there is a possibility of transfer between the two. This also affects verbal stems that end in N, like the verbal stem otzen or itzwen. So vowel change also affects verbs, depending on the stress. The verb to tell. These languages have very often gender or class markers at the beginning of the word, consisting of single consonants. And verbs that have an N originally at the ending, like you see in avar bitsine with the preterite bitsana, to tell, they've preserved the N and they've preserved the B at the beginning. But if you go into Andic and look at the preterite, you can see that some languages more or less behave like avar. They have the B as a class consonant and the N at the end still there. But others, like Northern Achwach, they have still the N there, but the N has become, you could say, suprasegmental and has turned the B at the beginning into an N. And other languages have lost the N at the end, like Botlich and dialects of Karata, where the B turns into an M, and the final N has been lost. So you see the phenomenon cuts right across languages, even across languages. Some show it and some do not. In Cesic, systematically the final N is lost, and we see somewhere else in the root, usually in the first syllable, nasalization appearing, like in the Cesic examples of this same verb, nisse, etc. It seems to be probable that the nasalization is old, and that restoration of B and R, for example, in Avar and Andic, is an example of regularization because it's simplification. But all these instances might interact. So you can have N and R and syllable loss all occurring and interfering with one another, and you end up with complex etymologies like avarbusen for bed or nest or lair, where in the Gigatl dialect of Jabalal in the Andic group, you get the B turning into an M. Northern Achwach suddenly having an R at the beginning instead of the expected B. Tsez having an M again at the beginning. And this means fiddling around with complex reconstructions with something like B with a vowel, with an R with a vowel, with an sh or a ch, and then an N at the end, with complex paradigmatic alternations that got straightened out later on, creating a fairly complex picture that really needs more work in order to figure out what's going on. And the second example, I'll be brief about that, is the word for head in Avar Beter. This also shows very complex, interfering sound changes. And finally, consonant metathesis is very frequent in these languages, especially when an obstruent followed by a resonant is found, which usually occurs, it only occurs intervocally because at the beginning of the word it's only a single consonant that's allowed. But if obstruent plus resonant appears in the middle of the word, very often also depending on the nature of the consonant involved, very often there's metathesis where the resonant comes first and the obstruent comes later. Still there and productive in Avar, but that's a phenomenon that you find elsewhere as well in other languages. It also occurs when the two consonants are not adjacent. So in consonant 1, the vowel consonant 2, where very often the consonants swap. many examples of that in Nikolaev and Starostin's dictionary, so it's well known to occur. And again, I refer to an example we've already seen, the word for chest or breast, where Cesic points to something like kommer, but the k and the m have switched places in other languages, as you can see here. And another complex issue is the word for bottom, where n and seem to switch places. And syllable loss occurred as well. So you get something like hitl, vowel n, so this is the last line. And what you actually lose is everything preceding the in lak and in tabasaran. And these must have found their origin somewhere in a paradigm with switching accent, where you get rounding and unrounding of vowels, where you get loss of initial syllables in some cases, especially if that's a weak syllable with a weak onset, which means a vowel onset or a pharyngeal laryngeal onset. And you get metathesis, which makes it something that's very complex to disentangle. Now you get many examples of that. Basically, the structure is you start with a root or a stem consisting of 2 syllables. These are the most complex ones. And then you can lose the second syllable. That's the second column. Or you can lose the first syllable, the third column. And it's quite common in these languages, and it remains still to figure out under which circumstances either of the two happens, or the original 2 syllables are retained. And funnily enough, and I'm jumping back quickly to the bigger questions, there is a pre-Indo-European substrate in Europe which shows the type of alternation that sounds very East Caucasian, if we remember the instances just discussed. Where you get words that seem to have an R at the beginning and then a truncated vocalism in the rest of the word. That's the column on the left-hand side. And the same etymons then appear without the R and usually with a fuller vocalism. Now, this is just tantalizing that sort of a morphological structure like East Caucasian is here turning up. Is quite clearly not individual identifying, because, 3 consonantal roots with vowels alternating all over the place is also typical of Semitic. But none of these etymologies go back to Semitic. None of them, as far as I know, perhaps with the exception of the first one, has a known East Caucasian interpretation. But it's just tantalizing that this old substrate in Europe, pre-Indo-European, doesn't look very Indo-European at all, but you could say typologically as a type of inflection that is reminiscent of East Caucasian. Now, I want to close off with 2 etymologies. One is the word for camel, about which I published, so I'll be briefer about that. And the other is a word for metal, which I think is new, and I want to go into in slightly more detail. And this will address the question which I started with. East Caucasian, is that, as we know it, a remnant of a much bigger, geographically much bigger East Caucasian family, which was originally present also outside of the Caucasus, or not? And this, I would submit, is one indication, and one indication is too little, but it's one indication that indeed East Caucasian might have originally been present outside of the Caucasus, well outside of the Caucasus. What's the argument? Well, there's a word for camel in Caucasian languages, well represented in the Nach branch, where Standard Chechen has mkal, and there are dialectal forms, which you can then reconstruct to Proto-Chechen as amkel or amkil. Then there's the archaic Cheberloi dialect of Chechen, which has the form ankal. Cheberloi is archaic because it preserves, in almost all cases, the original vocalism of the second syllable, which most other dialects do not. They turn it into something written a, and normally pronounced something like a. So Cheberloi gives rise to the reconstruction of a form am-kal. So we now have basically two reconstructions, am-kel or am-kil, we can't decide. For Standard Chechen, am-kal on the basis of Cheberloi, but also the Itum-Kali dialects. And there's a form in Ingush, which is in-kal with a very strange e. A similar word is also present in Czesic, only in West Czesic, homokuli, and in Hinuk, homokilo. Now this word is too long by decent Czesic standards. It doesn't look like it's a single word with a single origin in Proto-East Caucasian. It's probable that in this case the word for donkey interfered with the word for camel, so it's difficult to make sense of this entirely. And finally there's Kartvelian, the Georgian word aklemi, and the Mingrelian arkemi, which is normally not reconstructed for Proto-Kartvelian. So the assumption here is this must have been related either to the North Caucasian form or, as we will see later on, to the Semitic forms. And there must be a relation between the Georgian form and the borrowed Beshta form aklamo and must be aklam. But the details are slightly unclear because of the different vocalism in the second syllable. That they all sort of belong together seems reasonable. But it's also reasonable to ask what a camel is doing in the Caucasus. So let's look slightly further afield. As I argued in the article, and I won't go into the details here, all these East Caucasian forms can be reconstructed as akmal or akmil, with a vowel alternation that is, as we discussed earlier. Because of its setup with the consonants K, M, and L, there's no doubt that this is related to the Semitic and Indo-European word for camel, but the question is how exactly. Of course, we have the English word camel in the many European languages, which is borrowed from Latin camelus, which in turn was borrowed from Greek kamelos, and the general idea is Greek got it from Semitic. We have these West Semitic forms, gamal and gamla, etc., which I list here, jamal in Arabic. Fine. And there's nothing wrong with this until, of course, we meet up with the East Caucasian forms. Because as soon as you acknowledge that the East Caucasian form must belong to this cluster as well, the question is, if all these forms originate in Semitic, how did East Caucasian acquire its initial A? And I think that's an insurmountable problem. Or it might just happen to be the case that in Proto-Semitic there was a form with initial A, which happened to have been lost in all languages, and we happen not to have only in the form in which it was borrowed into East Caucasian. But as long as we don't have that, that's not a very attractive hypothesis. If, on the other hand, it was Semitic that borrowed from East Caucasian, so the other way around, then it suddenly makes sense, because we know about these East Caucasian alternations in complex paradigms consisting of words of two syllables. And if we start with a paradigm like akamal, akamil, basically from the basis of akamal and akamil, we can derive the East Caucasian forms. But if we lose the initial A, as we might in a proto-paradigm, this might be the predecessor of both the Semitic and Indo-European forms. Okay? Maybe it's different, and maybe this is a very early borrowing into East Caucasian itself, but then we must assume it was thoroughly nativized, so it's very difficult to distinguish it from any native paradigms. And now, when we look at camels, of course, people normally think they come from Africa, but they don't. None of them come from Africa. Dromedaries come from Saudi Arabia, originally from the Arabian Peninsula. The Bactrian camel, this is what the animal is. What we are talking about is native to the cold and dry deserts of Central Asia. We know it was domesticated at least in or before the early 3rd millennium BC, because we have clay models of camels drawing a wagon in southern Turkmenistan around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Almost around the same time, they appear in Sumerian as well, camels, where they are called elephants. So the word for elephant is used to denote a camel, elephant of the road, elephant of the mountain. And there's a hypothesis that perhaps they were domesticated much earlier than the 3rd millennium in Mongolia. And there's the tantalizing word for elephant in Tocharian, which defies etymology, which is onkalam, Enkelmo in the reconstruction, which again looks very much like the word for camel we've been discussing. So, and I'm almost wrapping up now, was East Caucasian once present in southern Central Asia? Because it's unlikely, if camel is a word of East Caucasian origin, it's unlikely that this was the center from which the word for camel spread, because culturally you don't expect them to be there. Whereas if East Caucasian was originally spoken also further to the east, let's say in Turkmenistan or the Central South Asian area, in which the Oxus civilization flourished around this period, well, then it suddenly makes sense. And I just said it's just one example, only tantalizing example, doesn't prove anything, but now there's another, which is the word for, and again I start with Czech, the word for lead or tin in the Czech languages, which is kebu in Czech, etc., and in Eastern Czech it is kobo, which points to an earlier paradigm, kobe, oblique kibbe. It's present in Andic as well, where it means iron. Also the form kob or kub. And it is possible to reconstruct the B here as a W at an earlier stage. That doesn't need to be, but you can. And that's what I'm doing now. So we have a pre-Avar-Andi-Czech paradigm, ko, with a vowel, and an oblique stem, q, followed by a vowel, which means some sort of metal, whether it's iron or lead or tin, we don't know yet. Now, let's look wider afield. I think it's rather tantalizing that a very similar form occurs in Uralic languages in the Mordvin area, where kive, or kivi, means lead or tin, which looks surprisingly like the oblique case, you could say, the oblique stem of the Avar-Andi-Czech languages. But a bit far away from the Caucasus, you would agree. There's also the word kuwanan, meaning copper in Hittite, which looks rather similar, only it has an N. So it's not just K-O-W vowel, but it's K-O-W vowel N. Possibly also Hatik Kinawar, if it is from Kiwanar. But the most wonderful example, I think, is the Iranian form for iron, which occurs in many Iranian languages, and I give you in small print all the attestations. And they reconstruct like something like Atshwan, with a palatalized tse, which normally reflects the Indo-European palatalized K. And it has an A in front of it, or not. And it has an A in the middle, or not. And it has an N at the end. It also occurs in Tocharian, form Enchuo, where it has an R at the beginning, yes, but it also has an N following it and not at the end. So again, we're looking at a word which, in this case, doesn't have an Indo-European etymology. Most words for metal are borrowed anyway, so that wouldn't be strange in this case, especially in the case of iron, which was at least the industrial production of irons. Basically, we're looking at the end of the second millennium BC, which is fairly late. But it looks like it was already there in Proto-Iranian, so before 1000 BC. And it has this form which is strongly reminiscent, again, of the type of paradigm you would expect on the basis of East Caucasian. And the final bit, looking at another word for metal, which is in the Casic language family again, the word for iron there, ger, ker, etc., which reconstructs as kill or gil, with a strange alternation ker or ger, which is not normal in these languages, so it's irregular, which doesn't have clear cognates outside of Casic. Perhaps there's one single avar form, giro, which means a metal weight or scales, which might be cognate. But maybe there is a cognate which has escaped attention, which can be found in the word in Avar, gilauka. Now, gilauka means, what's in Russian normally translated as funt, so it's a unit of weight approximating 400 grams. So it's a unit of weight, but it can also mean a metal weight, which is used on scales in order to weigh things. And in the plural, it can mean scales itself. So it doesn't mean metal, but it means basically a piece of metal or something made of metal. And this very much looks like a compound of our word gil, which we found in Casic, meaning iron in Casic. And the auka, that looks like the word we've just been discussing, which is present in Kebo and Kobo, etc. Auka from aqua, with the usual reversal of consonants, and then going back to the same paradigm. It was borrowed in Andic, also in one dialect of Casic, where it means a traditional lock. So again, a metal object. And then, of course, we can draw on, and I'll be quick because I'm over time already, but you get the idea. If we start from a compound, gil, plus the other metal word we've just been discussing, it's also possible to explain strange words in Avar and Archie with an N in it. And this, if this is all correct, and note especially all these forms found outside of the Caucasus that are interesting, pointing to forms being borrowed, especially the Iranian form. And finally, the last slide. If we look at East Caucasian compound gil plus akiwan, then suddenly we have a candidate for the etymology for the Balto-Slavic word for iron as well, which reconstructs as gelez, Russian gelezo, obviously, but also Lithuanian gelezis, etc., perhaps also chalkos in Greek. And the interesting thing here is that these are strange words in the Indo-European languages, which people generally agree come from elsewhere, they were borrowed. But it's only in East Caucasian that these forms make sense as a compound. And that's all I have time for, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much for the talk with so many points to consider. And I guess now we have about 30-40 minutes for general discussion. So anybody who wants to ask questions can raise their hands in Zoom, and we'll have the questions. But as the informal chairman of the seminar, if I may, I'd like to ask the first couple of questions. One is very general, and one is more specifically about Cesic. So the general question is actually why within East Caucasian, the focus is specifically on Cesic and Cesic historical phonology. Is it just sort of random, or is it because there is some special interest in Cesic based on connections with Indo-European and possible loan words or something like has just been demonstrated? So why is the focus on Cesic?
It's arbitrary. I just happened to look at Cesic out of an interest to look into the history of Caucasian languages. I could just as well take a completely different branch.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a question of shaking the tree and see what fruit falls out.
I see.
And this is the fruit that happens to fall out, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So if you shake a different tree, different fruits fall out.
Of course. Okay, thank you very much. And the second question then is specifically about Cesic. If we could scroll the presentation back to where you discussed the issue of labiovelar consonants in Cesic.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's see.
Yes.
Is this the one?
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm, this one. So am I correct in assuming that essentially the labialized variants here are some sort of morphophonological variants that arise specifically in paradigms like that in indirect forms? Or do you reconstruct labiovelars as fully autonomous phonemes for Cesic? Because I know that in the Nikolaev-Starostin reconstruction, there was a whole subset of labiovelar consonants established in particular based on some labiovelar reflexes that are allegedly still preserved in Genuch and maybe somewhere else. But here it looks like the labiovelars are specifically postulated to explain this weird vowel alternation, this ablaut in the paradigm.
Well, in a sense, you could say the unrounding of the vowel could be described as independent of the labialization of the consonant. I think that's been traditionally done because people have been discussing these vowel alternations, not only in Avar-Ambic Cesic, but also in Lesgian and Lak for half a century now. What I would state is, since I bring them together. I think that when a vowel is unrounded in pretonic position, there was always labialization of the following consonant, unless that consonant was a labial consonant itself. And because I'm able to reconstruct the entire phenomenon back to Proto-East Caucasian, because Nach is taking part, I can state that in the Nikolaev, and maybe it's even older. I don't know about how West Caucasian deals with these forms because it has not so many features. So maybe it's even North Caucasian. So it goes back really, really deep. And what I would claim is that this is one of the sources of Nikolaev Starostin's reconstruction of basically full labialization of all consonants. One of the sources. Maybe the only source, maybe not. I don't think it's the only source, but it's one of the sources.
That's curious because they don't actually reconstruct any labiovelars in the paradigm for sun, for instance. They just reconstruct it as bok, indirect stem, bik, or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
I'm sorry to intervene. It's very unlikely that it seems unlikely that no Cesic dialect, and we now know forms, oblique forms of all of them, has labialized consonant in the in the oblique stem, betzuer or bequer. In Asach or in Kidaro, this would have been presented as labialization, would have been present as labialization, I think.
Even before and
yes,
e?
Yes.
Because normally but you know better than I do. I think normally labialization, if it's preserved before a.
Labialized ko is possible, like zekwe.
Hmm.
And other contexts. It's not very likely that labialization could disappear in the position etse or ekhe, etsue or ekhe. In Cesic, this it is unlikely to disappear for labialization here.
Well, if that is, and I'm obviously willing to follow you in that, then my way out of this problem, Yakov, would be to say, well, then apparently labialization was analogically removed because it enhanced the irregularity of the paradigm, so it could easily be removed by analogy.
But basically, it's reconstructed just the reflexes are exactly the same, right, everywhere. So k and kw give k in null forms. So it's mainly just because of the vocalic alternation, right, that it's reconstructed.
Well, so if Yakov is right, and I said I'm quite willing to accept that at least in Bikwe, the word for sun, at least after a uvula, labialization should appear in some Cesic dialects, in some Cez dialects at least.
In fact,
it doesn't.
In fact, in all of them, but
yeah.
sometimes it disappears in some dialects with no obvious explanation, but mainly it is not the phonological context in which labialization disappears.
Let's see.
Of course, paradigm labeling is a explanatory device, but as very often it's too strong because paradigm labeling can explain much. Just this.
Here we have a couple of examples where labialization is preserved, for example. You would expect the same in the case of, it says, of course, it's rounding. I don't have a good example anywhere on my handout, but I must look into it. I know in Kidaro it's never preserved. And in many other dialects, it's only preserved if the following vowel is A, and it disappears for any other vowel. But you say there are also dialects in which it is preserved before other vowels. Says, right?
The verb for ride a horse, zekwe, or the verb be, the copular verb.
Yes, but that's zo or zokru, right? Zo zokru, but that's rounding of the e. So if you zokhui becomes zokhu in
yes, but
that's right.
Labialized core in other Cesic languages.
Okay, yeah. Zekwe in Hinuk, I think, right?
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Misha.
Yes, my question is, can we look at the word for chest or breast?
Yes, certainly. Let's see, where is it further down, I think. This one?
Yes, this one. So my question is, how do you explain the various reflexes of either labial M or cornal N? So are they some fossilized class prefixes, or is there a change, some regular change between M and N, and if yes, in what positions?
That's a good question. I've been asking myself as well, Misha. there is indeed the idea that many of the nouns, substantive nouns that start with an M or with a B or with an R or with an N, that consonant in fact reflects an earlier class marker. Especially Joanna Nichols uses that very often to explain such forms, but not only her, it's a tradition. The word for heart, for example, which starts with an R, that's very often interpreted as a fossilized class marker. That might be the case. At the same time, there are quite a lot of examples. So if you were to go through Nicolai and Stuyvesant's dictionary, there are quite a lot of examples of alternations between M and N, where it is not clear what caused it, what governed it. For example, in Avar dialects, it seems quite clear that in front of a labial vowel, there's a tendency for an M, the labial, to become an N in some dialects. So the pronoun for the second person, the personal pronoun for the second person plural, for example, is muj in southern Avar, but it's nuj with an N in northern Avar. So there it cannot be a class consonant. So it's an alternation somehow being context governed. In this case, my supposition would be it has to do with the presence of a labialized vowel somewhere. But there are many more instances of that also outside of Avar, where I really have no idea what causes it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, please? Timur, yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Maybe a small comment to what Yakov Georgievich wrote in the chat. He suggests that Avar, Gilavka, and its cognates originate from the Russian 19th century Germanka, the pound weight from Germany. I haven't heard about this etymology before, but I know the words like Gervanka is in some Lesgic languages, and I know another etymology which is not so recent, probably, but at least Abayev suggests that the word also exists in Persian, Armenian, Georgian, but the ultimate source is probably the Russian Grivenka from grivna, also used as a measure for gold and silver. Yes, I will paste a link to Abayev's dictionary online. I'm not sure which is the correct etymology, but just an idea that indeed maybe this word is not so ancient, but is a relatively recent or old borrowing.
Well, thank you. That's very disappointing, but thank you very much, Timur.
Yes, of course.
Sorry. Maybe a folk etymology. I'm not sure it is not. Germanka may be a folk etymology.
Yes, maybe. Because probably this word is
because it's
older.
Yes. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm finished.
Okay, well,
if I'm just one comment to that. Thanks very much for that suggestion, which completely passed me by. So that's my mistake. Your suggestion quite clearly explains the strange forms with an R instead of an L and with a nasal somewhere in it. So Grivenka, Gervanka, which occur in southern Avar dialects and in Lesgic. I'm not quite convinced about the Gilavka yet, because it's phonologically rather removed from the forms you mentioned, and they undoubtedly influence one another.
Okay.
But thanks very much.
That's an open question still. A question from Alexander Savelyev.
Thank you. I'd like to add that the same word, Girvanka, or the like, is also widespread in the Volga-Kama region. For example, in Chuvash, in Dmari, and specifically in Udmurt, it is just Girvonka. So, and it is considered to be a loan from Russian hryvnia as well.
Okay.
Well, that clears that up, definitely. Thank you.
Very good. Jakub Georgic.
Yes, and speaking of, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Speaking of the beshta, what you call shallow sound changes, beshta is a synharmonic language. In beshta proper, there are front syllables and back syllables, and in the Tladal dialect, there are front words and back words. So the development of velars and liquids often depend on the quality of the vowel in the same syllable. So speaking of what happens in beshta, it's useful to remember that syllables undergo changes, or even words as in Tladal, rather than individual consonants or individual vowels. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So my question is about one of your first slides, where you say about two branches of the East Caucasian family, the Nakh branch and the Dagestanian branch. Do you really believe that Nakh and Dagestanian are two is the primary bifurcation of Proto-East Caucasian?
I'm not qualified to have an informed opinion on that. What I usually find is that Nakh is closer to Avar-Andictesic than you would normally expect if Nakh was the first to split off from Dagestan. So I'm not convinced that it is correct, but I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yes, okay, thank you. As for me, I also I have no my own opinion about the first bifurcation. Maybe indeed Nakh and Dagestanian, and maybe Lesgian is the first outlier. I don't know myself.
Yes, we're still waiting for the perfect statistics on the Caucasian. Okay, any other questions, comments from anybody? Okay, if there are no more questions, then I'll probably just summarize things with the last general question of Peter, what do you think the future directions of your research on this whole thing will be? So where do we go from here?
Well, what I hope is that more people than, well, basically just me and a small handful of others take an interest in reconstructing the historical phonology in detail of East Caucasian. Because that's, I think, the only way to tackle the bigger questions. I think it's important that Indo-Europeanists take more of an interest in this language family. Whether you believe they're related or not, it doesn't really matter. But they've been in close contact. That seems to be very clear at an early stage. So I hope more will be known about contacts. I'm quite sure archaeogenetic studies of ancient populations within the Caucasus might throw light on population movements and therefore also possibly on language movements. But you know, it's as you started out, it's a big language family with complex languages and a lot of work. And even if one writes a big book about it, it's very unlikely to be the last word. If you look into the history of Indo-European, about which we've been working for more than 150 years, I still think there's a lot to be done. And the interest is I think still that we're not just looking at a random language family, but a language family that has a lot of potential in answering the bigger questions I started my talk with. And maybe they will all turn out negative and it's all a mirage. But I'm not convinced that it's a mirage. I think there's something more to it.
Okay, well, that's kind of a promising answer. Are there any actual people, like promising students or somebody working in Western universities on the historical phonology of Caucasian languages? Is there any chance of us seeing something like that in the near future? Do you know?
The answer is no. There's no one. I'm working on it alone. There's another Dutch colleague, Jesse Wigger-Schreur, who likes to work on the historical grammar of the Nach languages, but he doesn't have a position. So it's unclear what the future holds. And I don't think there's anybody else.
Yeah, because
I'm sure there isn't
I
anybody
think
else.
it's kind of problematic over here as well, but well, Jakub Georgievich and Timur probably are better aware of the situation than I am, or anybody else here, but overall situation is rather grim here, I believe.
Yes,
Absolutely.
especially because since 1994 we have a tremendous amount of new data, which have not been yet taken into account, and still expect future research. Speaking only of dictionaries, for example, very, very much new data.
Yes, a lot of new data that really haven't been taken into account in the 1994 dictionary. So that alone is a huge task to just incorporate all the new data that has accumulated since then. And clearly, once it's incorporated, will very significantly influence the current state of the reconstruction. But somebody needs to do that. So let's all be on the lookout, I guess, for somebody. No more questions? No more questions, no more comments. Peter, thank you very much for the very interesting talk and lots of different observations on phonology and lexics and everything. And hopefully not the last time. Maybe we'll see you again. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for all your extremely valuable comments. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's what we are for, and that's what the seminars are for. We always like lengthy seminars with plenty of discussion, more than just brief conference talks where people make a point and nothing to follow up on. So these sessions are always productive and instructive. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody for participating and for your questions and comments. And that's probably all for today's session. So we'll keep everybody informed of the next sessions, next plenary sessions of the Nostratic seminar. Thank you very much for coming. And that's about it. I'm stopping the recording now.